The Rhapsody of the Seas wasn't just a cruise ship. It was a floating empire, a palace of excess adrift on an endless blue canvas. From a distance, it gleamed, its white steel hull slicing through the waves, sunlit decks stretching toward the horizon. But inside it was its own universe, a place where time softened, reality blurred, and indulgence reigned. Mornings arrived gently, light spilling through stained glass, gilded railings catching the first hints of dawn. Chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, prisms scattering color across velvet lounges. The dining halls, wrapped in glass, framed an ocean so vast it seemed to stretch beyond imagination. It was easy to forget the world beyond, easier still to ignore what lurked beneath. Below the opulence, the ship breathed, a mechanical hum vibrating through polished floors, a steady pulse beneath thousands of feet. It felt unstoppable, a fortress upon the sea, a beast too big to fail. For the Bradley family, this was more than a vacation, it was borrowed time. A week carved out for laughter, warmth, and the illusion of escape. Amy Lynn Bradley had been the most eager of them all. She carried an energy that couldn't be contained, a fire that crackled in her every move. She didn't just live, she devoured life. But the ocean is a liar. It glistens, inviting and serene, disguising the silence beneath. A silence that takes without warning. The sea does not return what it steals. For over 2 decades, the Bradleys have stared into its depths, waiting for something, anything, to rise from the abyss. But the ocean only listens. The Rhapsody of the Seas drifted in the fragile space between night and day, the horizon smudged with indigo and gold. The ship, so alive in daylight, had settled into a hush. Engines murmured beneath the floors, the wind whispered through empty corridors, waves lapped lazily against the hull. Amy shifted in her sleep, murmuring something about air before stretching upright. A simple thing, a harmless thing. Her parents barely registered the movement. She was 23, independent, capable. Why would they worry? It was just a breath of fresh air, a quiet moment before the ship reawakened. She would be back in minutes. But Amy never came back. At first, the explanations were easy. A sunrise walk, a quiet moment alone. Maybe she had stopped to watch the water. Maybe she had run into someone. Then the minutes stretched. 30, 40, an hour. The silence changed. It was no longer soft, no longer empty. It pressed in. Dense, suffocating. Ron checked the bathroom. Iva scanned the balcony. Brad glanced at his watch. Where was she? Maybe she was on deck, watching the sunrise. Maybe she was in the dining hall, chatting with a stranger. Maybe... Then came the calls. Amy. Louder. Amos. Voices sharpened, rising over the hush of early morning. Footsteps quickened, corridors stretching into a tunnel with no end. Passengers glanced up from coffee cups, curiosity shifting to unease. She's probably at breakfast, maybe she overslept. But then, the air shifted. At first, the search was calm, methodical. Amy had to be somewhere. The ship was enormous, but not infinite. They checked the cabin again. The bed was empty, undisturbed. Shoes by the door, clothes folded, nothing out of place. A knot tightened in Ron's chest. Amy. His voice cracked. Amy. Eva's breath hitched, her calls turning to pleas. Chairs scraped, passengers stiffened, coffee cups stilled midair. A ripple of unease spread through the deck. A fear. Hallways stretched endlessly. Carpeted floors absorbed their footsteps, but nothing softened the dread pressing against their ribs. And then the realization settled in, cold and absolute. No one had seen her. The ship was vast, but not vast enough for someone to simply disappear. And yet, Amy was gone. The panic set in fast. They tore through their cabin as if she might somehow be hidden inside it, trapped in a space too small for logic to explain. Nothing. No crumpled sheets, no spilled drink, no sign of a rushed departure. It was as if she had been plucked from existence, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of her perfume. Their search expanded. Footsteps pounded against plush carpets, voices sharpened into desperate calls. The Rhapsody of the seas, once a vessel of adventure, had transformed into something else, an indifferent labyrinth of locked doors. The crew's response was suffocating in its casual indifference. "She probably wandered off," they said with a shrug, a nod, a glance that barely masked inconvenience. Run's hands curled into fists. His voice came sharp, unyielding. "My daughter is missing." Still, the ship moved forward. Security was finally stirred into action, but it was a performance, a shallow mimicry of urgency. They checked common areas, skimmed through lounges and pool decks as if they expected to find her sipping a drink, amused by the chaos. But this was no misunderstanding. Somewhere on this ship, Amy had vanished, and no one seemed to care. By the time the Rhapsody of the Seas docked, the Bradleys weren't just searching for Amy. They were fighting for someone to believe she was missing. Then the FBI arrived. They moved with purpose, crisp suits and hardened expressions cutting through the haze of confusion. There was no sympathy, no comfort, just protocol. Surveillance footage, witness reports, timeline reconstructions. The questions were relentless. Some answers came easily. Some had to be dragged out. Then, a name. Again and again. Aaron. A crew member. Ordinary. Forgettable. Except Amy had noticed him. And he had noticed her. Too much. Too often. Brad replayed her words in his head. How she had mentioned his lingering stares, the unease in her voice. He had brushed it off, thought nothing of it. But now, it gnawed at him. Had he ignored the one warning that could have saved her? Darren sat stiffly across from Agent Markham, fingers twitching against the table's surface. "I was on duty," he said, his voice careful, measured, too even. Markham leaned back, slow, watching. "You saw nothing?" A flicker, a hesitation, just for a second, but enough. Enough to know there was more to the story. "No." A pause. I don't think so." The air in the room tightened. Markham exhaled slowly, tapping his pen once, twice, then with a quiet, unnerving calm. "That's odd, because 3 different passengers saw you watching Amy that night." The room felt smaller, the silence felt heavier. Darren's fingers twitched against the table. I noticed her. You couldn't not." His voice wavered. She was unforgettable. Markham didn't blink. "You watched her." Darren swallowed hard. "Not like that." A beat. "I just wanted her to know I existed. A confession without a crime." The words landed like a gut punch. But Markham knew better. Obsession was one thing. Abduction was another. And yet, there was nothing solid tying Darren to Amy's disappearance. No physical evidence, no witness who had seen them together at the moment she vanished. The security footage was reviewed, frame by frame. It captured Amy stepping onto the deck in the early hours of the morning. But it never showed her leaving. The ship had become an impossible paradox. Vast enough to hold thousands, yet too confined for someone to simply disappear. And yet, Amy had. Ron and Eva refused to accept the unthinkable. They didn't wait for answers, they demanded them. The cruise line, the authorities, the media, no one would ignore Amy's name. They flooded every news station with her face, her story, her smile. They combed through every detail of her last known whereabouts, reconstructing her final movements with the precision of forensic analysts. And then the whispers started. Sightings, a woman resembling Amy, in Curacao, in Aruba, in Barbados, always close, but never close enough. Hopes surged, then collapsed under the weight of dead ends. The descriptions were never quite right. The details never fully aligned. Amy was everywhere, and yet nowhere. The ocean, once a shimmering dream of adventure, had become something else entirely. A predator. A vast, unfeeling abyss, holding either Amy's body or the truth of where she had gone. And the truth remained just out of reach. Jessica Reed had seen impossible cases before. She had cracked lies wrapped in layers of deception, exposed truths buried beneath indifference. But Amy's case was different. The silence around it was calculated. It smelled of a cover-up. She started with the obvious, Darren. His demeanor during the investigation had always struck Markham as too composed, too measured. And now, as Jessica dug deeper, the pattern emerged. Women had complained about him before. Unwanted attention, stares that lingered too long, a hand on a shoulder that wasn't invited, a quiet history of inappropriate behavior, one the cruise line had dismissed. Misunderstandings, they called them, overreactions. Complaints had been buried, reports quietly discarded, a reputation preserved at the cost of safety. Jessica found something, an old security log, altered timestamps, missing footage. Darren wasn't the only loose end. He was part of something bigger, something deliberate. But she also knew that the truth didn't end with him. The ship itself held secrets. She turned her focus to the cruise line. Documents had vanished. Timelines didn't add up. Statements had changed. It was as if someone had carefully scrubbed away anything that might lead to real answers. Had Amy been taken? Had she been forced off the ship at a port, unseen? The Caribbean, once a paradise, had become a labyrinth of possibility. Countless islands, endless hiding places. The Bradleys, following Jessica's relentless pursuit of truth, searched tirelessly, handing out flyers, speaking to locals, following every sliver of a lead. They found doors slammed in their faces. They found kind strangers who wanted to help. They found hope over and over, only for it to slip through their fingers. And then the message came. Anonymous, cryptic, just a few words. A remote island, a hidden cove, a secluded beach. A fragile thread of hope in a sea of uncertainty. Jessica and Brad followed it, their nerves stretched thin, adrenaline buzzing beneath their skin as they arrived. The cove was eerily silent, the air thick with something unspoken. The waves lapped against the shore, indifferent to the weight of what they might find. Then the first sign. A discarded piece of clothing. A faint trace of perfume in the salty air. A trail subtle but undeniable. It led them inland, away from the water, into the dense interior of the island. Their footsteps barely made a sound in the damp earth. The air was thick, oppressive. And then they saw it. A shack, weathered, hidden in the overgrowth. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, dust hung in the air, catching the dim light that filtered through cracked wooden slats. And against the back wall, a photograph. Amy's face staring back at them. Next to it, newspaper clippings detailing her disappearance. Objects, trinkets, a shrine, a stalker's lair. A place built from obsession, shaped by a mind twisted enough to believe Amy belonged here. Jessica's breath caught. Brad took a slow, deliberate step forward. Somewhere, in this vast, indifferent ocean of secrets, Amy had been alive. And someone had been waiting for her return. The shack's discovery sent a tremor through the investigation, a chilling glimpse into the mind of someone who had been watching, waiting. Inside, obsession clung to the air like damp rot. A faded photograph of Amy, newspaper clippings of her disappearance, handwritten notes scribbled in the margins. It wasn't a hiding place. It was a shrine. Darren was brought back in. This time, the cracks in his composure were impossible to mask. Under mounting suspicion, his words unraveled, spilling out in disjointed fragments. His fixation on Amy, the way he watched her, the fantasies he built around her. But even as his confessions turned to rambling, one thing remained unshaken. He denied harming her. I just wanted her to notice me. The phrase, repeated like a prayer, sent a chill through Jessica. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Amy had not simply disappeared. She had been taken. What had once seemed like an isolated tragedy now pointed to something far darker. The details didn't add up. Not just Darren, but the missing records, the altered statements, the gaps in security footage. Clues hinted at something beyond one man's dangerous obsession. A network. a system, a pattern. The Bradleys were forced to confront the unthinkable. Amy wasn't just missing, she had been stolen. And if she had been taken, she could still be alive. The possibility was both unbearable and galvanizing. The investigation no longer revolved around a single suspect, but an orchestrated operation, one that preyed on the unsuspecting, exploiting those who let their guard down in places designed to feel like paradise. The deeper Jessica dug, the more the lines between negligence and conspiracy blurred. The cruise line wasn't just careless. It was complicit. Jessica's relentless pursuit unearthed damning evidence. Internal complaints buried, security reports altered, patterns of misconduct ignored to protect the illusion of luxury and safety. Darren had been a problem before Amy, but he had never been a problem worth fixing. Until now. The cover-up was deliberate, the silence was paid for. The Bradleys weren't just fighting for Amy anymore. They were fighting against a machine designed to erase people like her. Leads continued to emerge. Whispered names, sightings too vague to confirm. A woman resembling Amy... Curacao, Aruba, Barbados. A flicker of recognition in the eyes of strangers, a moment of hesitation before denial. She was everywhere, and nowhere. The Bradleys followed every thread, each lead a cruel balance between hope and devastation. They traveled from island to island, haunting the places where she might have been, where she might still be. Their search turned into something more, an education in crime, in corruption, in the underbelly of paradise. They became detectives. They became warriors. They became the only ones willing to see the truth. They encountered kindness, locals who shared what little they knew, who mourned with them, who pointed them toward whispers of something hidden just beneath the surface. And they encountered indifference. Closed doors, tight lips, people who knew more than they said and said less than they knew. Amy's face became more than a missing persons poster. She became a ghost, a warning, a whispered name traded in the dark. The ocean, once a symbol of freedom, had become something else. A vault of stolen lives. The land, just as silent, held its own secrets. And Amy? Somewhere in the tide, her name lingered. Years passed. The search never stopped. Leads faded, but the Bradleys refused to let time swallow their daughter the way the world had. Their journey became more than just a hunt for answers. It became a battle against time itself. They were no longer just a grieving family. They were a force. They fought for answers, for justice, for Amy. And still, they searched. Decades slipped by, the waves unchanged. The whispers of sightings flickered like dying embers, each one a cruel tease of hope. And yet, the Bradleys kept searching, their voices carried by the wind. Calling out for a daughter the sea refused to return. They had stared into the abyss for too long, waiting for something, anything, to rise. But the ocean only listens. The ocean does not return what it takes. The Bradleys know this. But still, they wait. Still, they search. And somewhere, out there, Amy's name lingers, whispered in the tide, lost but never forgotten. If you enjoyed this video and want more dark, gripping stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.